Good afternoon. My name is Jirapadi Techasen. I'm the honorary librarian of the Siam Society. Some 20 months ago, in the council meeting of July 2022, Dr. Chris Baker reminded the council that in less than 2 years' time, the Siam Society would turn 120 years old. It was then agreed that a committee would be formed to look after the planning and organizing of a special program for the celebration of this special occasion. 2 months later, I was named the chair of that committee. Although the society usually takes the 10th of March as its anniversary day, for the fact that the first council meeting took place on that day in 1904, it is factually 2 weeks earlier of that year when some 30 men met at the Oriental Hotel on the 26th of February and agreed to form themselves into what would be called the Siam Society. So technically, no one will disagree that now the Siam Society is 120 already. And we gather here this afternoon to mark the beginning of the celebration program. For 120 years, lectures have been one of our major means of sharing knowledge. Indeed, many individuals have been speakers at the Siam Society to share their knowledge and insight on Thailand and neighboring countries, which have always been our objective. I am therefore very pleased that the first event organized for this occasion is lecture. I am also grateful that it is Dr. Chris Baker himself, together with Professor Pasuk Phongpaichit, who will shortly debut this lecture series. The topic of their lecture stems from the latest publication of their translation of the oldest Thai poems from the 15th century. Incidentally, making the Thai literary works available to the global communities of audience has been one of the themes reflected on the pages of the Journal of the Siam Society from its early days. So it seems that there is no more fitting lecture than that by Dr. Baker and Professor Pasuk to be the first of these 120th anniversary lecture series. As someone who took part in organizing this event, it is my sincere hope that everyone will enjoy themselves as well as this lecture. But to make sure that it is enjoyable, I have a bit of housekeeping to do. First, this event is being recorded, both photographs and video, for future dissemination through social media platforms of the Siam Society. I'm reminding this in light of the Personal Data Protection Act, so that you can choose how you would want to appear or disappear in this recording. This leads to the next point. Please turn off your mobile devices, or at least turn them to silence mode. This will help the speakers deliver the lecture smoothly and ensure undisturbed recording. Last, but certainly not least, there is no planned fire drill this afternoon, so in case there's a fire alarm, we'd better evacuate. But in that unlikely event, don't panic, keep calm, look for the exit, and leave this room in an orderly manner. I guess that's enough for housekeeping. So without further ado, I would like now to invite Madam President Kun Pilaipan Sombatsiri to address us all and to introduce the speakers. Please, Madam President.
สวัสดีค่ะ Thank you very much, Chair of the Organizing Committee for 120 years. You've done a great job, both housekeeping and introduction. Well, dear members, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to the Siam Society. Thank you very much for joining us at this special event. สวัสดีค่ะคุณคริส and คุณภาสุข We haven't said hello to one another. This year marks the 120th anniversary at the Siam Society. Guided by the motto, knowledge gives rise to friendship, or in Thai, วิชายังให้เกิดมิตรภาพ It has always been the mission of the society to promote pioneering research, study and knowledge sharing in the arts and sciences of Thailand and the neighboring countries, to place our region on the knowledge map of the world and build friendship across the boundaries of nations. Today, to continue this tradition of our distinguished forebears, we are honored to welcome two of our long-standing and beloved members, Dr. Chris Baker and Dr. Pasuk Phongpaichit. Dr. Pasuk Phongpaichit is Emeritus Professor of Political Economy at Chulalongkorn University and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Thailand. She is best known throughout her 4-decade-long career for academic works in the issues concerning corruption, the informal economic sector, economic disparity, and land distribution. Dr. Chris Baker is a historian of indefatigable perseverance. He has been an active member of the Council since the late 1990s and served as the honorary editor of the Journal of the Siam Society from 2009 to 2023. In 2021, he was elected the Society honorary member, and last year he received the honorary doctorate from Chulalongkorn University for contributions to Thai history. In 2017, Dr. Baker and Professor Pasuk were jointly awarded the Fukuoka Grand Prize for the prominence of their multidisciplinary and comprehensive research and their great social contribution as eminent intellectuals. It is therefore hoped that this lecture, which launches our 120th anniversary series of activities, will inspire people of different generations to join in the effort of the Siam Society to increase understanding and build friendship across the boundaries of language and nation through dialogues and sharing of knowledge. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Chris Baker and Dr. Pasuk Phongpaichit.
Thank you very much to Ajahn Jarabadi and to the President for that very kind introduction. And thank you all of you for coming this afternoon. It's good to see so many people. Although this is a joint work, for simplicity's sake, I'm going to do the presentation. Pasuk is just here to make the podium a little prettier. So, that's right. So, as you have heard, we are a historian and an economist, and we are over 150 years old. So what are we doing talking about poetry? Very, very good question. We are going to talk about these 5 works, literary works, and they all date from around 1500, over 500 years ago. And they seem to be the earliest surviving works of literature written in Thai. Now, you can dispute the definition of literature, and there are other things which are basically ritual text or historical works. And there's Mahachat Kam Luang from this period too, but that's a translation. It's not an original work. These were creative works intended for an audience, and I will talk a bit about audiences in a minute. We have now translated and published all 5 of these, first Yuan Pai and then Lilit Pra Law and Tawatot Samat. And today we are launching Nirat, Hariphunchai and Gamsuan Samut, which we call Ocean Lament. Before going on, we really have to pay respect and thanks to some people without whose work we would never be able to do this. And these are particularly Chantik Grasasin, who was a self-taught scholar from Hua Hin, who became a very important figure in the literary world of the mid-20th century and did the first academic editions of a couple of these works. Prasert Nanakorn, a phenomenal linguist and historian who was actually an agronomist by training, who also did terrific work on this and who died and was a stalwart of this society and died quite recently at the age of 100. And especially Winai Pongsipian, who did the original work on several of these poems and was very, very helpful to us and very sadly died a couple of years ago. And we'd also like to thank one other person who's been critical to that enterprise, and that's Trasawin Jiu of Silkworm Books, who has been so much more than a publisher all the way through. Now, these 5 are really very, very different indeed. Yuan Pai is a poem about a battle, which is also a royal panegyric. Lilit Pra Law is a story. It's a rather romantic and tragic story. The other 3 are kind of love laments in one way. There's a bloke lamenting over a girl, all of them, but in very different circumstances. As we'll see, 12 months, it's some kind of royal who's doing it. Nirat, Hariphunchai, maybe another royal from Chiang Mai. An Ocean Lament is somehow some kind of adventurer, but we'll come into that as well. They're all quite long, but really very different indeed. Lilit Pra Law is over 4,000 lines. Yuan Pai is about 1,200, and the other one's a little bit smaller than that. And first off, I'm going to talk about some of the mysteries of these works in general. And then I'm going to talk in more detail about 3 of them, in detail and in very different ways. We tend to assume with a literary work that it was written by some person, an author, at a certain time, on a date, and it has a certain title. With these, you have to throw away, or you have to at least get flexible over all of these. Out of these, there's only one of them, and that's Nirat Hariphunchai, that has a date. There's a date in a Lana form of the lunisolar calendar that comes out as 13th of October, 1517. So that's the only one we have a secure date, but some scholars have suggested that that's wrong, that actually it cannot have been written that early, and it's been backdated deliberately to make it seem older. I don't think so, but it makes that date even so not secure. Yuan Pai is about a battle that takes place in 1474-75, so it was probably written very soon after that. The other ones are really very vague when they were written. The dating is pretty secure in this time because of the language. Thai language changed very significantly between the 15th and the 17th century, and these ones are all very clearly in the language which comes at the start of that time. Now, titles. We use these titles today, but were they the titles when they were written? We know, for instance, in the case of Nirat Hariphunchai, it was not called that, because the idea of Nirat, a travel poem, which also contains a lament for a lost lover, was only invented 100 to 200 years after this poem was written. So it certainly wasn't called that. There are some hints that it was called Klong Meung Bao, which is a reference to the date I referred to earlier, which is rather unusual. And some people say it was called Lam Lapoon, which just means the lampoon poem. So they're like kind of nicknames rather than titles put on the work. And possibly Yuan Pai is similar because it's just a rather unusual phrase that appears in the last stanza of the poem. The others, an Ocean Lament is even more curious. The name of a poem as Gamsuan Samut, Ocean Lament, was known, and the poem was known, but they were only put together in 1959. So do we have to think that these works had titles? Perhaps they didn't. Perhaps this whole idea that literary works have a certain title doesn't belong in this culture. Authorship is even more difficult to pin down. And partly that is because we always assume a single author. But in this case, it may be not the case at all. We know, for instance, that a lot of the folk literature from this region is produced in group singing, in counterpart singing between groups of boys and groups of girls. And we know, too, that in the court, the king and nobles entertained one another by composing verse and also competed against one another in composing verse, and that the kings had poets on their payroll to help them improve the verse as well. So we know, for instance, 12 Months, it has a verse towards the end that says this poem was written by one man, and it calls him the young king who's beside three worlds, which probably means he is a son or younger brother of King Chulalongkorn, which means refuge of the three worlds. But also it says these three other persons, Kunprom Montri, Sikawirat, and San Pasuk, help to polish up the verse, and they are titles of court poets. And also, works were not sacrosanct. After a work had been written, some other people could come along and think they might be able to do it better. They might try and rework it and improve it. So Lilit Pralor has a very strong narrative plot that ends with a very clear climax and ending, a tryst and then a massacre. But there's another bit being tacked upon the end. And its poem is a kind of Romeo and Juliet thing, where there is a tragedy brought about because of the political conflict behind it. And as we know in Romeo and Juliet, the Duke tells the Montagues and Capulets to get their act together in half a page. But in the case of Lilit Pralor, it goes on for 500 lines, bringing up a very elaborate process of reconciliation. And we suspect that this part has been tacked on the end later, maybe quite some time later in a different era, as a deliberate attempt to change the whole balance of the meaning of the work. And Yuan Pai, the war poem, is even more complicated. It comes in 6 very distinct sections. The beginning, there's a long eulogy of the king. There's then a section of historical background, and then another section of historical background, a part which is written like a drama I'll talk about later. Then a description of the army, and then the battle and the aftermath. And these are all somewhat different in style. And it's not clear why you should have two versions of the historical background. We suspect this is not the work of a single poet, but it's more like an edited collection of works which are all somehow collected to this battle in 1474 and have been put together in the same manuscript. So we have different kinds of authorships here. Yuan Pai may have several authors. Lilith Pralo, probably, it's clearly a work that came out of oral tradition and was probably developed by storytellers and was probably improved later on. 12 months has the sign of being something produced in the court by a royal with the help of professional poets. Nirat Hariphunchai may be rather similar. Some people believe it was written by King Mern Gao, who was the king of Lanna at that time. And we will talk about Ocean Lament in a minute, a little bit further down. So apart from these uncertainties about dates and authors and title, there's also quite a lot of uncertainty about what these works all say. And this was Pasuk Phongpaichit. When he started to transpose the text from manuscripts back in the late 1940s, and he had 2 or 3 different manuscripts he was working from. He said, this is so difficult, because all of them, these manuscripts I've got, are very slightly different. It's a very old poem. It has a great many words from the local Payak dialect, and many Pali Sanskrit words that are incorrectly transcribed into Thai, and many copying errors. So he said, I must have got quite a lot of this wrong. And we've had to rely upon the his work and that of others. So the way we deal with this is to put in enough footnotes to show where we think we're not so certain and where we feel much more secure. And then the other mystery is, why only 5? And why this 5? Because you think these are all quite accomplished literary works. They're very intricate in their use of poetic forms, meter and forms, figures of speech and all of that kind. They're very rousing in their ways. They all excite emotions very effectively indeed. So they show an awful lot of skill. So it's impossible, and there's these different genres too, it's impossible to imagine that back in that time there really were only these 5. And there's a literary manual that comes from the 17th century called Jindamani, Jewels. And part of that is like a training course for poets, giving them examples of good verse which they can try to emulate. And some of those we know. So the one down here is the famous Siang Re Siang La verse from Lilith Pralo. But most of the rest of them, we have no idea where they come from. Did they come from works that have disappeared? Or were they the product of exercises by the nobles and the king in the courts, in whiling away the long evenings? We really don't know. But probably a lot has disappeared. And that's not surprising, because manuscripts written on koi paper deteriorated. They either fell apart because of the heat and the damp, or they got eaten by insects. So they had to be copied regularly, usually within 50 years. And Siam developed no printing technology and no university. So the only institutions which had this ability to recopy and store and preserve were the Wat and the One, the palace and the monastery. And this means that apart from religious texts, these literary texts are mostly either by kings or about kings, because of course that's what they wanted to preserve. Now, I'm now going to talk about on 3 subjects. I'm going to talk about 3 sets of these poems, and from a very different angles in all 3. And part of what I'm trying to do is to show how interesting these works are, because they're very little read and very little studied even today. And when they are studied, particularly by literary ajahn, they tend to be interested in the issues of the author, date, and the style. They tend to be interested in things like the technical aspects of meter and so on. They show remarkably little interest in what they are actually all about, which is what we are really interested in. So I'm going to start off talking about war with Yuan Pai, then talk on love, by talking about Lilipa law and 12 months, and then finally look at the last two, which are both hailed as precursors of Nirat style. We launched Nirat Hariphunchai here a bit over a year ago, I think, so we're going to talk just about the new one today, which is Ocean Lament. Now, Yuan Pai. This, as I said, this very rather complex poem with many different sections. And I'll start off by talking about this fifth section, which describes the army. Now, reading this was very important for us when we were trying to write the history of Ayutthaya. And in fact, we wrote a draft of this history way back over 20 years ago in the early 2000s, but somehow it never sort of clicked. The story didn't seem to have a drive to it. And one of the things that helped was reading this poem. In fact, it was very, very helpful indeed. And in this description of the army, the major part of it is a description of 51 war elephants. And each of these elephants is given a name, and it's a rather sacred name that either comes from Khmer or from Pali Sanskrit. And it describes how beautiful they are. Jamru and Jakapat, the ears and tusks and trunk and swishing tail, both tall and bold like something from a dream. And then it describes how good they are, how clever, how good they are in battle. Gael Jakarat is skilled, adept and strong. Panpum Monton, immune to pipe and gun, magic, in other words, he's immune to it. Tau Tepayan seems made by magic law, and Mern Monsak shaped to fill a foe with fear. And it sums up at the end that some so superb surpass a city's worth. So the elephants are really valuable, and they're praised in this kind of way. By contrast, only 2 humans are mentioned by name, apart from the king. And they are not accorded these kinds of descriptions, fancy names, praising their heroism and their valor. Nothing like that at all. They just pass by in the thing. So there's clearly something about the values of this period that you begin to see here. Then, if we go to the last part, the battle, and particularly the aftermath of the battle, the victory by the Siam forces. And here, the Lao here means the head of the opposing army. The Lao in flight, head locked, collapses down on his elephant. Troops swirl with saber, goad, and shield. Sparks fly. The pikemen cheer, the tusker thrusts again. The Lao hangs headless from the tusker's neck. His blood wells up and flows away till gone. And after that, there is this amazing verse. Among dense tamarinds, the panicked Lao are knocked down to their tuskers' feet in droves. Amid the din, are caught and slashed down dead, like row on row of felled banana trees. And I don't know, somehow this line, this image, of slashing down banana trees. I mean, we know war poetry is bound to be bloodthirsty. It's supposed to, summon up the blood in this way. But there's something about this one, that is really, very, very, very hard and very callous indeed. And after this victory won in this way, what then happens is the looting. All sides we chase them down and round them up. We group to strike the city, catch and kill, seize silver, gold, our men out of control. We tie up prisoners, drag them round by horse. When tired, they're sold away or swapped for booze. Right? So you begin to see here, and this is the first hint, I think, that war is also economics. That back in this period, the way you became a success in the life, the way you accumulated goods, became rich and so on, was through success in war, not through trading and other things like that. War was a transfer of resources. It was for the kings who defeated another king. They weren't capturing territory. They're not really interested in capturing territory. They're taking away loot, silver, gold, Buddha images, women, and slaves. Okay? And that's in the transfer at the level of competing kings. And then further down, there's the similar transfer among ordinary people. Because we see in this poem and in the chronicles that soldiers collected heads from the battlefield. And then if you go to the laws, there it's in great detail how the rewards and punishments for performance in war. So anyone who rides a horse to battle and takes a head is rewarded with a golden bowl, cloth, and promotion. And a prior soldier or king's guard, in other words, an ordinary grunt, who takes a lord, a big guy on the other side, is rewarded with good gold, good silver, appointment to eat a city, to govern a city, and a royally presented wife. So he goes from near the bottom of the social scale to somewhere quite near the top. So this is the kind of movement, this is the economy of this time. And I think through this, and then looking into the background of that, it was clear, that there was this period, really rather nasty period in Ayutthaya history, which we called an age of warfare. And it clearly had a very different ethos and a very different economy to the period we know much more about and is much more familiar as Ayutthaya, which is the period particularly of King Nirat, when the foreigners come, the Dutch, like Van Vliet, write about Ayutthaya, the French come in Pranarai and they write, and there's this king who's interested in astronomy, and it's all rather elegant. Clearly a very different period. So you can then start to write the history by periodizing and look at the forces which are behind each of these periods, and also which drives the change between them. So that was very important. One of the other amazing fascinations of this poem comes in this section, which we call a drama. The other 5 sections, all narratives. There's an Olympian narrator who tells us about the qualities of the king, who tells the historical background, who describes the army blades. In the middle of this is a section which is a drama. It's written like a drama. It has a cast of characters and it has speaking parts. It's completely different from all the others. And this is about this. This warring of this battle, and for a long period, was a struggle between Siam and Lanna to control the area in between, which the old Sukhothai kingdom, which Ayutthaya calls the northern cities. And in this contest, this place which in the poem is called Chengchern, was a very important strategic place which changed hands many times. This is what we now call Si Sachanalai. And then there's a historical character, Mundong Nakhon, who appears in the Lanna Chronicles several times. He was a leading general of Chiang Mai, and around 1461 he was appointed to govern Chengchern by King Tilok of Lanna. But then, a few years later, Tilok fears this guy is going to go into revolt, he's either going to split the realm or is going to challenge me. So he summons him to Chiang Mai and intends to kill him. And so when the messenger comes with that summons, Mundong knows exactly what is going on, and he gives this speech. "Oh, sir, don't shilly with this sham, speak straight. As urgent news has come, I must go now, and this accords with my intent as well. Whoe'er does right will never come to grief. A subject keen to die for loyalty, though just a man in this elusive world, will be among the angels in the next. On high with Indra, God and Lord supreme. A subject that the king supports makes rich, who then does not maintain his loyalty, may live 1,000 years like a corpse, and dead descends into the seas of hell. I should not stay here thinking, but take leave, to pay respect to him of royal merit, Tilok. Though he may lock me up and take my life, let stories spread that I was true to him. And true enough, he travels to Chiang Mai, and as soon as he arrives, he's executed and his body is stuck up on a spike on the city wall. But then when news gets back to Chingchun, his wife, his widow, summons the people to a meeting, and she says this: "So many men, though good, are spun as bad. Mundong was summoned there on false pretense. The Lord, Tilok, well knew that Dong is truly good, yet feigned to find him treacherous, disloyal. This Lord," meaning Tilok, "abused and harassed his own father, the one to whom he should have been devout. He killed beyond belief his own sweet son. Both subjects and non-subjects he browbeats. This Lord is truly dumb and evil cur. Why should we suffer more beneath his sway? We should remove our land to serve that king, Trilokanath of Ayutthaya, depend upon his city as once was." So she calls upon that city to defect to the Ayutthaya side, which they promptly do. What happens to her after that, we have no idea. She's one of the very few female characters who appears, and particularly with this wonderful speech. So what we have here, fascinatingly, is a debate about loyalty, where Mundong is giving the absolute version, that loyalty is absolute. You have to be loyal to your master. But the widow is saying, no, it's conditional, and loyalty is forfeit, if not reciprocated. And what is fascinating once you've got this bit out of this drama that's somehow been put in the middle of this very royal poem, is that actually this story is full of examples of disloyalty. This fight between the three areas, between Lanna, the northern cities, and Siam, starts off after Trilokanath has a quarrel with one of his brothers-in-law, who then defects to Lanna. There are, as in the speech, we hear that Tilok came to power through a coup against his own father, and he fears he's going to be upended by a coup by his own son, so he kills him. And Chingchun changes hands at least twice during them, because someone inside opens the gates to the enemy. So it's scattered with these examples of disloyalty. And yet, in the middle of a poem, the whole work, which is ostensibly a very pro-royal work. And this you will only find if you read this literature. You won't find it in the chronicles, you won't find it in the foreign accounts. It's this kind of rather subtle thing that comes up only when it gets preserved in literary works like this. Okay, I am now going to go on and talk about these two poems, Lirit Pralo and About 12 Months. And talk because they're both amazing celebrations of love, including celebrations of physical love, which are really quite unusual. Of these 5 works, Lirit Pralo is by far the best known, the best and the most famous, and the longest. And it's a story of how King Law, who's the king of an imaginary state, probably somewhere in northern Siam, and 2 princesses, Pern and Pang, from the neighboring state, fall in love with one another without ever having met, purely by hearing troubadours tell about how beautiful the others are. troubadours come around saying, this King Law, he's wonderful, he's really handsome. And they fall for him, and they arrange for the troubadours to go and tell him about how wonderful they are too. Then, there are 3,000 lines of suspense before they are able to get together. And because there's so many obstacles in the way. There's his mum, who doesn't like this idea at all. It's their families who are in the way, and then there's a big tract of jungle in between that they have got to get through. So there's this long suspense until we finally get to the tryst. And the tryst starts off with a foursome, because his two manservants and the princess's two maidservants meet up in a pond at this royal park where they meet. And they first make love in the pond, then on the bank, and then in the pavilion, at the end of which the maid leans forward and asks their lovers, "Where are you from? How are you called? Pray tell, so we may know your names." Which is really very nice. It's wonderful. This is then followed by a threesome between King Pralor and the two princesses. Now, this Pralor has been dramatized several times by the great actress and theatrical entrepreneur Patrawadi. And one of us from about 7 or 8 years ago, I think, is on video on YouTube. Well, not on YouTube. Okay, so I'm now going to read her the tryst with her beautiful dance of how it goes. Entwining arms with arms in tight embrace, flesh pressed to flesh, oh flesh, so soft and pleasing flesh, breast pressed to tender breast, belly pressed to belly, oh soft belly, lovely breast. A lotus blooms, unfolding like a smile. A flower within a flower hid within a sacred lake. 1,000 pleasures in her lake. A fish frisks freshly, feels a lotus flower that blooms. Like a horse of senses 5, his power by passion multiplied. He pounds apace with no respite. He's like a tusker mad in must, with thrusting tusk and clutching trunk, clung close in clinch caress. And then after a short pause, there's a second round, and here their lovemaking disturbs the universe. Loud thunder blasts the heavens, shakes the skies. Earth quakes, is almost wrecked, and bellies churn. At sea, the roaring waves are whipped to foam. What wonders here? Trees yaw and sway all sides. A lion king is nuzzling snug his lioness. A tusker jogs his mate to jig and play. A golden deer strides spryly forth to sport, while rabbits, squirrels gambol, couple chase. But all is even not over yet. The three then bathe together in a large jar, which, quote, incites a little playfulness, and they eat together and then part with great reluctance and confessions of undying love. So this whole tryst scene, from the maids in the pool until they finally part, is 700 lines long, roughly half a Shakespeare play, which must be the longest of such scenes in world literature. Now, one of the difficulties that Thai literary people have had is that this story has been in the school curriculum since the 1930s. How do you do it? Well, you leave a lot out, at least that's what you do. Okay, then 12 months. Now, if Pralor is probably the best known of these, 12 months is one of the least well known. It was probably written in the time of King Chulalongkorn, so late 15th century. And as we say, the author was possibly the king that's besides three worlds. Chulalongkorn brought one of his relatives to be sort of joint king, and he went to stay in Pitsanulok and put this other relative in charge of Ayutthaya. It's probably a brother rather than a son. Then the poem, it is a lament for a lost lover. We don't know where she has gone. It doesn't say. We think she's probably died, and that really this is a kind of elegy. But the poem is told across a year of mourning, and it's framed by the 12 months, the seasons, and other changes in the world. But at the beginning, before he starts, he writes 14 verses, which I think you can see is to tell us, the readers or listeners, why he misses her so much. My sole young heart partner, surpassing words, best budding bloom I 10-touched care caressed, embraced your body's beauty, supped the finest taste, and never left you lone past half a watch. I miss your special, soft, sensuous tongue that fired my heart and roused my lust. I miss your scent, your dulcet voice divine, flesh pressed on tender flesh to seem as one. I miss the times of roving like a Naga lord, my arms embracing, circling, coiling round, the beauty of all beauties, passion's taste, deep loving, sliding, winding, folding tight. I miss caressing golden lotus, holy lake, dipping down past lily bud, parting petals wide. I miss my cherishing the perfect flower's crown and prying part the world flower below Meru's mount. I miss the lovely lily, gem of lotus flowers, petals duly parting wide at watchbeat times, for bees to suck the taste and dip the golden lake, to slide inside and bathe in fragrant streams. This was first printed in Wachirayan, which was the kind of journal of the court intellectuals back in 1904. And then there was an edition edited by Prince Somot, who was son of King Mongkut and the private financial manager for King Chulalongkorn. And then it came out in the Wachirayan Library edition, that one, this picture's the one that's down there, with a preface by Prince Damrong. And this was the same for all sort of major literary works of this time. So it was well known and well respected back at this time. But from this publication in 1925, it kind of disappears. And while Prince Damrong wrote long prefaces about many other works, which were reprinted many times, on this he wrote basically 3 lines, okay? And he didn't. And he sort of deliberately misunderstood the poem in those 3 lines as well. And it then more or less disappeared until a few years ago, to 2017, where there was this new edition published by the Siam Anthropology Center, done by this team, including Dongjai, who is a historian who's spoken here several times, Winai, who I said recently has sadly died, and Samer, who is basically a Sanskritist, a Sanskrit scholar. But they also have an article in this publication by Sasitorn, who is an anthropologist at Silkworm University. And she writes very interestingly, she says, you know, this work has been kind of condemned and disappeared because people see it as being too erotic. And this is because the custom of Thai society is bound up with the moralistic frame of thought, with the result that the poet's unrestrained portrayal of passionate love has been criticized for being too erotic. But in fact, she says, the work is a good example of a poem that reflects the mindset of Ayutthaya of its time, so that present-day society may see and understand about the display of passionate love. And in fact, you can go, I think, even a bit further than she does here, if we accept, as the poem seems to tell us, that the author is a royal. that he is a king, or a young king at least. And in this poem, he indulges and shows us his indulgence of very strong emotions, very strong passionate love, and then indulges his sorrow at loss in the same way. And he shows himself to be kind of naked, both physically and mentally at this time. And this comes, of course, before the rise of absolutism in the Thai monarchy, which really comes in the 17th century when the monarchy gets rich. And at that point, part of the way these riches is used is to elevate the monarchy, to make it very distinctly different from society. They get enclosed within palaces with high walls. The language of Rajasa, special language, and a lot of ritual designed to make the royals seem to be superhuman. So this poem is a reminder that things were not always this way, that there was a period before this when there was not this elevation of the king in this way. And while this elevation has changed from era to era in Siam, Thailand, you can say that it's really more or less still with us. Okay, I'm now going to talk about Ocean Lament, Gamsuan Samut. And this is interesting because it's also a story of a great literary hoax. Okay? In 1767, when the Thai nobles, many of them, were swept away to Burma, they were then debriefed, a typical intelligence debriefing. They were asked to tell everything they knew about the government and politics and monarchy and history and economy of Siam. And in that debriefing, one of the things they tell is a story about a poet called Si Prat. And he was a poet at the court of the king, probably King Si, right at the beginning of the 18th century. And King very much liked his poetry, but at one point he did a poem for one of the king's ladies, and it was discovered. And normally at that time he would instantly be executed. But because the king liked his poetry so much, he does not have him killed. He just exiles him to Nakhon Si Thammarat. But when he is down there, he repeats it. He gets muddled up with one of the governor's women, and the governor does have him executed. But before he is executed, while he is tied up to the stake, he issues a curse to say, "Let this sword that kills me later kill the person who had it kill me." Okay? And sure enough, a little later, the king in Ayutthaya misses his favorite poet, sends a message down to Nakhon Si Thammarat to have him sent back, finds out what has happened, and promptly has the governor executed with the same sword. This story was known in Bangkok, in early Bangkok, because it's repeated bits of it in other sources. But it's especially known after this documents from the Burma debriefing come back to Siam in the late 19th century and get translated into Thai. Then, in the early 20th century, this man, another of these self-taught provincial intellectuals, Paya Pariyati Tamtada, who is given the name Per Dala Lakshmana by King Wachirawut. He spins out this story from just being this half page I showed you just now to being 50 pages, with much more detail, much more poetry of this whole story of Si Prat. And this was published actually probably a little bit before 1919. Okay? Then it continues to grow, this thing. So here in Journal of Siam Society in 1958, Seni Pramod, the to-be Prime Minister of Thailand, he presents another translation, his own translation of this famous the famous curse which he gives. And he also says, he adds, that he not only delivered this curse, but he wrote it in the sand with his toe while waiting execution. Now, if you know that executions are done like this, and if you look at the complication of the tie, it was quite a feat, wasn't it, to write it with your toe in the sand. But this whole story, it was just so fascinating. It goes into the school books. It goes into the first studies and histories and compendia of Thai literature which come out for university study in the 1950s and 1960s. It goes into the 3-volume collected works of Ayutthaya literature produced by the Fine Arts Department. Only then, in 1959, Mimam Chao Janjiriyo Rachani, another pillar of this society, Tan Jan, he writes a work, he does an edited version of the poem, and he says, this is rubbish. There is no source, no documentary source in Ayutthaya, Bangkok, Nakhon Si Thammarat, or anywhere else which mentions the story and which mentions Siprat. It's come completely out of nowhere. And he also says the language clearly is not the language of the 17th, 18th century. And others, but he repeats it, point out that the journey down the river, which is covered in this poem, that there are 3 shortcut canals that are dug. And we can see from the poem that he goes round the loop. You know, he names places round the loop. And he would clearly not have done that if he was in a hurry, if the shortcut canal already exists. And this means he must have gone down before 1542. So the Siprat story has been blown up, but it's still, I think it's still taught in the schools, and it's probably the only thing about Thai literature that most school children remember. So, anyway, the poem, apart from this Siprat, there's only 2 things that people have been interested in. One is this Siprat story, and the other is by saying it's a precursor of the Nirat genre. So it's not looked at very much for its own merits. It's always been looked at in a very strange way. But it's a very, very interesting poem. It starts off with our narrator. It's an I poem. It's standing in the middle of Ayutthaya. He's standing here between Wat Sanpet and the audience halls. And he starts off, as you always do, with a celebration of the city. Ayutthaya's renowned from sky to earth, survey the world, the soul's celestial flower, trillions have found no tiny blemish. But then it changes very quickly in the next verse, into a celebration of what a good place it is to flirt in the evening. At dusk, the players, the troubadours, pick and pluck in many styles, walk strumming plia, which is like a Jew's harp, songs to court a lover. At dusk, a girl and boy arrange to meet. She says, don't come to me by day. At dusk, tears flow as the couple trysts. Back in their rooms, the girl and boy yearn for night again. At dusk, lover, stay a while, don't go. He teases, grabs her arm, she parries, trembling hot. At dusk, they vouch their love in tender words. Both know the ways to use the tongue to stir the heart, which is a lovely line. Okay. But then, again, a big surprise. Suddenly, we are at the wharf and he is being bundled into a boat. And he says, the messengers came. I forgot to quickly give them this. You are Si Chulalak, my beauty, my good fortune. I call them near and send this off. I'm desolate to be parted from you and board the boat. The rowdy servant girls attending fill the bank. I'm desolate. I look all round and send my heart. This letter I send to the servant, send to you, send myself. And the rest of the poem is what sometimes called a messenger poem. It's written in terms of messages that he is sending back to her while he is being chased away down the river. We don't know why he has to leave. The name he gives her, Si Julalak, is the name of a royal consort. So there may be something from the Siprat story that is still there. But we don't know whether it is really that consort or he's just using it as a nickname. Okay. So he then travels down the river. And as he goes, he starts every other verse by saying, farther away, farther away, farther away. And there are, as we say, there are some verses that are in the style that is later developed in the Nirat, particularly by Suntornpu. And this is when the traveller passes a place or an incident which stirs some memory of the loved one left behind. And in this case, he passes through a place called Mango Village, and it reminds him of her slicing mangoes for him to eat. But there are actually not many of such verses. There's only a few of these Nirat-like verses in there. What is fascinating is the number of different ways that this poet finds for portraying his loss. And in fact, a lot of the place names mentioned as he goes down is not like Nirat, it's just more like a travel writer. So he comes to this place called Khompreng, which means a Khmer who's been pierced. And he tells this story that where the name comes from, because a Khmer who was working at cutting sugarcane got sadly stabbed and died by getting stabbed by the cane. So it's more like travel writing than Nirat. And also, as he goes, he's fascinated by the wildlife. There's a sense in which you feel he might never have been down the river this way before. So he sees the deer dashing around at too many to count, loosed buffalo crash, crunch with wild oxen, scores of sand deer forage in the space in the wild. I watch rhinos dance and prance, and this is around Nonthaburi today. And bunches of waxing flowers, thick with forest, rhinos bellowing. And he keeps trying to express, he's amazed by the flatness of this landscape. He sees, he's had the image of it unscrolling the landscape, it's so flat. And then he comes down and out from the river mouth into the Gulf, and he sees whales and dolphins, which he calls small whales. And he says, a sole whale leaps like a fish, stirs up mud, waves its tail to waft krill into its mouth to munch. And that's a bride's whale, who's feed in this rather unusual way, which you can still see in the Gulf of Thailand. He also expresses his distress by remembrance, by recalling in the past. And it's not quite as sexy as Tawatot Samat, but it's pretty nice. Your pretty navel bud, heavenly lady of mine, when you suck your belly flat, I shiver. Anyone seeing your midriff, their heart skips and fails like a tiny winged midge with no fear of death. Oh gods, when we two tryst, the lady's lovely hair, coiled on her head, comes cascading down. I think back to the two of us trysting, my jewel, the taste of beetle mouth to mouth, the scent of your sandal rousing through to dawn, me unfazed by flesh on fire, you fanning hard. And it's lovely, it's lovely. And he has also some lovely images of her as a dancer, which I think are very nice. I think of your slight figure dancing, my love. If the earth is no broader than this, can it hold you? Everywhere the eyes of the world are fixed on you, my love. The earth is strapped down by the sky and so survives. It's very nice. And he has an image throughout, too, of being split in two. Feeling himself, half of him is where he is on this boat going down the river, and half is left back with her. My soul stays at Ayutthaya, though my body's elsewhere. I think of your moon face, of the pain of parting, and I cry out, turning to the sky, turning to the earth. And one remarkable thing is Emotions are felt very physically by parts of his body, but particularly by his guts, his alimentary canal, by his stomach, his kidney, and his liver. His guts are gone, his guts a mess, gut heaves, drains my guts, guts roiled by lust without relief, wrenching out my guts, innards sag, kidney and liver go head over heels. And also then the breast and the heart come in. Breast is awash, burning, empty, pierced by thorns, bursting with fire, thumping like thunder, cringing, bruised, drooping down, shaky as this mast. And his heart, burnt, boiled, fevered, slips, skitters, splinters, howls, blackens and breaks, darkens to die, and goes off to roam the sky. And there's bits on his eyes and his teeth, and also all this extraordinary physical expression of his sorrow. He then gets down and out into the Gulf. And he's on a small boat. He just doesn't describe the boat, but it's got a sail and a rudder, and it's got a small crew, probably 3 or 4 people. So imagine it, some kind of small boat. And he has probably never seen the sea before. So he has lots of efforts at trying to describe, this very special landscape of seeing the sea and the sky when you're on the surface of the sea. How deep the sea is beyond reckoning, waves rolling away, look like the waters cleaving apart. Farther away, 100,000 yojana out of sight. Farther away, leaping, loping, sky skittering, scrunch. The sea sighs and groans. Can anyone survive? Farther away. Wind swirling, foam slapping, we fly flailing. It's the 2nd month, I'm chilled to the gut. And a lovely one, the sound of an ocean weeping is sound beyond sound. But then he has a storm. He runs into a storm. And, the Gulf is pretty calm and flat most of the time, but you can get squalls and storms, and they can be pretty exciting. And the Selatan, a southern wind, batters my face like a war brigade. The junk wind and tiger wind both beat the boat. The crew make fast the damaged mast, not to fall. Ahead, both flanks, the foam fans out like flowers. Astern, the foam hammers the hull, and waves wash by. Breakers careen and crash and so on. And he gets very scared, and he thinks he's going to die. So he makes a prayer to the gods. He makes a promise which is the promises that are done by bodhisattvas in the Jatakas all the time, where you say, because I've been such a good guy in the past, please do something for me now, O gods. And of course, at that point, the storm stops. Well, that's probably because storms in the Gulf usually last half an hour, but he thinks his prayer has been very effective, and he gets very, very happy indeed, and it continues on. So he runs out into the Gulf, he goes past Gotsi Chang, and he goes past Got Pai. And usually at this point, it's assumed he goes off and down, in the old story of Siprat, that he went off down the peninsula to Nakhon Si Thammarat. But now that we don't have Siprat anymore, it seems much more likely that he went off towards Cambodia and Vietnam. There's a few toponyms at the end of the poem, which no one knows where they are. We can't work out how they are. And then the poem comes to an end. And it comes to an end with this very famous verse, where he says, as it were, the message, as it were, has been delivered. So he says to her, keep this letter in your pillow, lady love. Do not read it for fun. At sleeping time, dancer, lie with it like a friend. Every evening, every night, do not leave it alone. But I don't know, it's too pat for me. It sort of ties it up too nicely. It strikes me it's one of those verses that has been added later by someone who is improving the poem. And I kind of like the idea that the previous verse is the last one. Farther away, out of sight, far flung. When I think back, my heart splinters and I pine. So you see, he's recapping the farther away, and the idea of being split up. One part of me seems now dead, now dust. The other part seems to see my lover with my own eyes. And in the old form, it was believed that end of the poem had been lost, because the end of the poem had Si Prat going all the way down to Nakhon Si Thammarat. But now we no longer believe in the Si Prat story or going to Nakhon Si Thammarat. I think it's much nicer that this is the real end of the poem, and that he deliberately ends with this image of him on a boat in the middle of the Gulf, with the great sky above him, going we know not where. And if you like, as an expression of love, loss within a landscape, this is really a very, very beautiful image indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Now we have a bit of time for conversation. So if any one of us here would like to say something, ask something, or many things, please, the microphones are available. And raise your hand and the microphone will reach you.
Hello. Yeah, really enjoyed this talk. Obviously, it's things that I'm interested in as well. So there's a rather specific question I was going to ask about Kompreng, that verse where it's a bit unusual and it talks about a Khmer person who died by, I think, walking into rattan or something like that.
It springs up and pierces him.
Oh, it springs up and pierces. I wondered if there was a sort of, because some people think of the Ayutthaya, it's kind of praising Ayutthaya and everything like that, and it's almost a kind of little jab at the Khmers who maybe come before or something like that, or is that just, no, I don't think so. Or,
I don't know. I really hadn't thought of that. I mean, it just struck me as a typical traveller's tale.
Right.
When you come to a place and they tell you a funny story about the place name,
Right.
Sort of typical thing you find in travel literature. So
Yep.
I didn't really think there was anything more
yeah.
than that, but you never know, do you? Yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm fairly new to the poetry of this part of the world, so I wondered, aside from setting and language, what is it about these poems that, be it device or form or theme, that makes them quintessentially Thai as poems?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, they, as it were, they have been selected by the winnowing of history. They're not there because they are Thai, right? They happen to be the ones that have survived, and we don't know how. I mean, I think that particularly these early, the three Love Lament ones, the two and the four last ones, yeah, that there's all of them struck by the intensity of the emotion they're trying to convey, and an enormous inventiveness in different ways of how they do it. I think this last one comes from somewhat. But the 12 months is the same, because it uses this framework of the year very, very creatively in order to express these emotions. So I think, I'm not sure. I mean, the problem is a sort of other side of your question, if you like, that because these are the only ones that have survived, they have been adopted as the national literature, okay? And in fact, in that process, actually they are changed, or at least the way they are presented today is very much changed. Okay? So Tawatot had to be almost sort of moved out of the canon completely. And Lilit Pralor has been changed quite extraordinarily in the way it is presented. Not only, as I imagine, how you present it in school and so on, but there is a huge genre of rewriting of Pralor. Story being rewritten as plays and particularly as novels, being done as films and theatre works, where they use the name and they use the names of the characters and then completely change the plot inside, and often just leave out the tryst that's the beginning, leave it out completely. So they have been, it's been difficult to have them to express the values of a national literature. I think it's very interesting.
Any question? Any more question? Kun Nawamin, please.
Thank you very much for the lecture. I would like to know a bit, there's two questions. First, when you find two versions of the poems, which one do you say is more accurate one? Because because there are more copies of those, or there are more versions of those, and to choose to translate? The second one is, I've never asked this question after all these years. What's your process in translating these? Do you translate it in prose first, and then verse, or right away to verse?
Okay, right. What we are trying to do is to produce a version of these poems which is good to read. There are some other translations that have been done which are very academic and they're word for word accurate, if you like. Okay, but have not tried to convert them into something that's easy to read. Now, I'm not saying by that we accept inaccuracy. We make sure that we are reflecting what we think is the meaning of the Thai very, very exactly. But we put a little bit more effort into trying to make it good to read. Now, in the where there are several versions, for the most part, they are usually only slight changes in wording. I mean, there are lots of those. And particularly Nirat Hariphunchai, there's a wonderful thesis done by a lady Ajahn in Chiang Mai over 40 or 50 years ago, which compares the different versions very closely and uses a certain theoretical approach for deciding which one is which is very, very interesting indeed. Okay, and that work is completely separate from the work that was done by Pasuk Phongpaichit and was taken up and then redone by Ajahn Vinay. So these two are completely separate on the same source material. When you go from those into English, there's actually very little difference. Because, this has been written at some point and it's been copied and spoken and changed in the wording very often, but not the meaning. And that's because, you see, there's so much of this was oral transmission. So the oral transmitter could remember what the line was saying, but when they spoke it, they might change it a little bit. And I think this is how a lot of the versions change. And that means when you then go to another language, there's actually relatively little difference. But where there is a difference, a real difference in meaning, or you simply cannot really be sure what it means, which is quite several times like that, we do it by just selecting what we think is the best version and then put a footnote in and say, this might mean something else. The process is we first go over the text using all the original materials you can, line by line by line, and actually write it, usually, take there and just literally write the English lines in word for word within the Thai text until you've got a fair idea what you want it to mean. Then we have decided that we will use blank verse to render these, sort of Shakespearean ba-boom, 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 blank verse to do it. That's because it's a form of verse which is relatively familiar to anyone who's been taught English in school. You've done some Shakespeare, so it's immediately recognizable. It's also it's akin to the verse forms being used in Thai, which are just slightly formalizations of everyday speech. And it's also not too difficult, which is quite important as well. So then I just do it over and over again, and while doing that part, I read a lot of poetry. I read Shakespeare and Seamus Heaney and people like that who use rhythms in very interesting ways. So, and in the end, it comes in there, I think. Yeah.
May I add here, Chris will recite it aloud a lot. Many times. There's so many versions, and he every time he will recite it around because he knows that all these originally may have been oral. Yeah, so that when you read, it's better than it's not too literary. It's written.
The C in Hua Hin knows this stuff very well. So.
Well, that is quite a interesting explanation of how you worked on the translation of these 5 poems. And I have a bit of continuation from the question that Kun Navamin just asked, because you have translated a lot more than just these 5. But out of these 5 poems, which one was the most difficult to translate and why?
Okay. There's two answers to that. One would be Yuan Pai at the beginning, and that is because the first part of that, the panegyric, the celebration of the king, is really very difficult. I mean, it's got an awful lot of Pali Sanskrit and quite a lot of Khmer and other bits. And even Pasuk Phongpaichit says this is almost impossible. And he wrote a piece saying, nobody reads this poem because no one ever gets past this part, this bit at the beginning. And it is, and it's very, very difficult indeed. And also that was the first, we'd done Kunchan Kumpam, that was the first. The other one is this one, is Gamsuan Samut. Probably because it is one of the oldest, and the language is among the oldest too. But also because it is written, it's almost like word painting, There's almost no grammatical structure at all. It's very imaginative in the way. And in fact, when doing it, I had a try at doing it as word painting, like a lot of very modern poetry where you completely abandon the structure of the sentence and just... And it's actually quite nice, done that way. But we thought that the audience just simply couldn't take it. You'd say, well, what the hell does this mean? So you have to give it a little bit more structure and meaning. But this one, Gamsuan Samut, very difficult, yeah.
congratulations that eventually you get them published.
Yes. Yeah.
And available for purchase. So we have one more question, I think.
I have a question. Right now you finished these 5 poems. 2024 came this year. And do you have any other future plans for other translations, maybe some other works?
Okay.
Can you guide us on that?
We want to do some more briefly.
No, talk about level. A few years ago, we started translating the old laws. Okay? And it happened that this thing called COVID came, remember? Right, okay. We fled down to Hue Hin before we thought they were going to close the road. And we said, okay, let's translate one of these old laws again. And we did one, and we thought that was fun and very interesting. So we did another one. Anyway, the Three Seals Law is this collection of law texts brought together in 1805 by Rama I, and published then to be the law code of Siam for the Bangkok era, until they're surpassed by modern law codes from the 1890s onwards. But mostly what it is an archive of legal texts that stretch from the 15th to the 18th century. And it's huge. And at one point we got halfway, so then you have to keep going. So we have a working translation of the whole thing. And, people think of law codes in Asia, you think of the laws of Manu from India. This is almost 3 times as long as that. It's over 300,000 words. It's enormous. And it is simply great fun, because you discover in the early years of the first reign, Rama I, and of course he's famous for his religious works, for doing a version of all the religious texts, holding a Buddhist council and everything else. But in that, there is a law in which he's very worried because the gambling dens are not making money. And that gambling dens are a source of tax. So, and he says why they're not making money is because the past king forbid the gambling den owners from giving a credit line to the host who's conducting the gambling. And because of this, the whole business is going down the tube. And the previous king stopped this thing, because what would happen is the host would run out of money, and he would owe the gambling den a big debt, and the only thing they could do then was tie him up and hit him and beat him up until his wife and his mother came to bail him out. And he thought this was not a very nice way to do. So King Rama I, he reintroduces credit lines for gambling dens, but he has a means test. He says if someone comes in and wants a gambling den, you have to sort of find out from them, if they're a farmer, how many acres of land do they have, how many cows do they have, which businessman, so on and so forth. But if it's a woman, look at her hands. How many rings does she have?
And also look at the retainers that follow
behind.
Particularly the women. There'll be lots of people coming with her.
It's wonderful stuff, and it's real social history as well. So we're going to publish that somehow. Finish.
Interesting.
And actually what's also Chris find interesting in me too is that a lot of the descriptions of the law is full of homily and rhyming rhyming words.
A lot of poetry in it.
Like a bit of poetry. And then we came to the conclusion that this is part of the Thai language, and in everyday speaking, they speak in rhyme. And so for making poetry, for a lot of people, come easy through this practice. And it also partly because the local language is a mixture of many other languages, and so when you describe something in one language, there'll be other people who have another way of expressing, and in order to reduce the confusion, then they string up everyone together, but in rhyme, and they all come from different sources of language. That's another interesting thing we find from this law. So that gives you addition.
Thank you very much for your talk, Dr. Chris Baker and Professor Pasuk. But I got only one question regarding your, the poetics of your translating of these 5 poems. Because actually you mentioned you have the model of blank words for the model of translating these 5 poems. So the fact that blank verses usually don't enjoy the end rhyme. So, and you already gave me the half answer, because actually this kind of literary pattern, let's say, is kind of easy to understand in one way or another. But I'm not pretty sure if it is the case for translating these poems in particular, because actually when we talk about the essence of Thai poems, we usually enjoy end rhymes in particular, and the fact that blank verses do not preserve the end rhyme. But I do hear when you say the rhyme and rhythm, or the meters, or any kind of figurative uses like alliteration or assonances, you do enjoy this kind of proliferation of literary word in a way. So how would you describe this kind of, I would call it trade-off between the way that you want to make it accessible by using the blank verse, but the loss of the end rhyme in particular. How would you describe this kind of trade-off phenomenon?
It's a very good point, and I would. Do you know Trent Walker? Yes. Have you read In Nirvana's Time? He has a wonderful description in there in the methods he has used for translating Khmer poetry, which is very similar, exactly the same meters. And he has a much more sophisticated solution to the problem than we have, in that he has 3 different modes. One where he abandons the rhyme completely, one where he keeps the rhythm, and one where he has more of the rhyming depending on the original. And it's very, very good. And I in a way, I wish I read his stuff longer ago. We might have put more variety into it. The forms, the verse forms that are used in all of these works, they have end rhymes, but they're chained rhymes, right? They're not a single rhyme, right? They're not like the rhymes you get in most English poetry, a couplet, 1 line, 2 line, and then another one. They will have chained rhymes, so they will have more than one bopping along, and the result is, whereas in the English version, you come to a stop at the end and you start again. The Thai ones, they have this great onward force. And really the only major poet who is able to do this in a Western language is Dante, and because it's very difficult to do. If you try and put rhymes into the English translations of Thai poetry, it comes out as really clunky. I mean, you will find there are some people who have tried it, and to me it just reads terribly. Okay, so that the idea is what we try to do is keep rhythm and a lot of the other figures of speech, particularly alliteration, assonance, and onomatopoeia, and these. Keep as much of that as you can. And if you go and look at what we have done and look at the verse in time, we have often managed to keep the same number of words alliterated and so on. We don't do it on every time. It's not always possible, but we try and keep those. But yes, of course, there is a trade-off, and a lot of the beauty of this early poem is in the mixture of the rhythm and the rhyme, so they're very controlled structure on these, which is control not only of the syllable count, but also the tone, so that you tone at certain places in the line, and then the rhymes, in linked rhymes. So it's enormously skillful to do this in the original. When we did Kun Chang Kun Pan, we did one page at the beginning and one page at the end, where we replicate the verse, the rhymes. Yeah. It was very difficult. I mean, it looks easy when you've done it, but it took us months to get it to work. Just a few lines. Yeah.
Any final comments or questions? So please, at the back, please.
Hi, with all the works that you've done so far, has there any word, phrase, or concept that you find quite untranslatable? And if so, how do you go about that?
We reinvent new. We reinvent.
Yes, I mean it's not. I mean everything can somehow be translated, I think, but it's a question of how wordy you want to be, because what is very often happening is, and this is something Paul McBain here has talked about as well, is that there are double meanings, right? And there's a lot in this verse, a lot, and you can tell that the poet is playing with those double meanings. But it's usually very, very difficult to convey anything of that. As a very simple example, in that lovely piece I read from 12 Months, where if you look, you find that an awful lot of the words in there have the ending lia, which means lick, right? You think they're in there by chance? No. You try and, but there's not much you can do about it.
Right. For the brevity of time, I guess we'd better conclude here. Ajahn Chris and Ajahn Pasuk will be around for a while for further conversation if you would like to speak to them. May I now invite the President, Kun Pilaipan, to present the token of appreciation to Ajahn Chris and Ajahn Pasuk. We begin with Kun Chris first. Ajahn Pasuk, please.